Hello, everyone. Welcome to the First Unitarian Society of Milwaukee's online worship service. I'm Reverend Dina McFeeters, and I'm honored to serve as Associate Minister. We welcome people of all genders, sexualities, ages, races, ethnicities, histories, and bodies. We welcome your mind, your heart, and your spirit. We welcome all that you are carrying with you today and all that your heart longs to set down. We'd like to pay a special welcome to guests joining us today. If you're visiting for the first time or joining us from afar, why don't you say hello in the chat and tell us where you're joining us from? I welcome you to our worship service today by inviting you to repeat our mission after me. We gather to nurture the spirit, engage the mind, and inspire action. Let's return to our beloved sanctuary for the lighting of the flaming chalice, symbol of Unitarian Universalism.
Good morning. My name is Paul Kozadowski. When I heard that Dave was leading a summer service devoted to the crisis in journalism, I jumped at the chance to add my modest 2 cents. Like many of you, I've read and respected his journalism for decades for the important public service it provides. Given the stories Dave will tell in a few minutes, what I have to share might seem pretty insignificant by comparison. After all, I spent my career as an arts writer, a critic, as many people call us with a scowl. As one of my editors once said, "You're writing about people's leisure time." True. Still, I think arts writing is important, and if you'll indulge me a little, I tell you why it is and why it has been important to me. Perhaps that will convince you to value it as well. The first piece of criticism I wrote, or should I say tried to write, was about the performance artist Laurie Anderson. This was the mid-1980s when performance art, as it was called, was catching on in a broader public. Anderson's signature piece was called Duets on Ice, which she wore ice skates frozen into blocks of ice and played the violin until the ice melted. Now, if someone came across a performance like that, either reading about it or seeing it on video or in person, I'm guessing there would be one of 2 basic reactions. Sheesh, what the heck was that? Or, wow, what the heck was that? I fell into the latter camp. I read everything I could about Laurie Anderson, sometimes in the most obscure and esoteric arts journals. I wanted to find out what it all meant and write a long think piece so that my readers would share my fascination, my insights, and my enthusiasm. The result was dozens of typewritten draft pages and a curious visit to the office of an underground newspaper, a dingy studio apartment filled with dusty books and an old mimeograph machine, which I hoped would spread my insights to the masses. Not this time. But my motivation did not melt away like those blocks of ice. I went to journalism school and learned more about craft and audience, and continued to read and learn about art, music, theater, and dance by reading journalists that did what I wanted to do. What they did was dig deep into the experience of a play, a ballet, a painting, or a piece of music. Good arts reporting can do that. Help transform the things we see on stage, screen, or in a museum from a diverting way to spend a few hours into the beginning of a conversation about our life and the world that digs deep and offers more questions than answers. That kind of reporting and deep consideration is harder to find these days. It's valuable to have someone you trust, whether it's a friend or a journalist, say, "You should see this, 5 stars." But it's also valuable to seek out writers or friends who are concerned with what happens after you see the show. It's not just about figuring out why that violinist was standing around in ice skates. It's about meaning and resonance, about challenging conventions. How did this director make a 400-year-old play speak so clearly to what life is about in 2022? How does this piece of music change our ideas of what's beautiful? Why does this painted arrangement of shapes and colors make me feel so serene or agitated when I stand in front of it? These are the valuable questions that arts writers and journalists are still asking these days. And seeking out their different takes on different art forms is more possible than ever with the internet. I suggest you look wide and deep. And when you find someone who's asking these questions, stick with her. It may take a little more time and effort to find these writers and thinkers, but it's so important that we do. And it's important to understand the work and ideas of imaginative creators alive in the culture and in our lives.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for your interest in journalism and the future of truth seeking. I want to start by looking back to the year 2010. At the time, I was in my 25th year as a reporter at the Milwaukee Journal and the Merge Journal Sentinel. I had accepted an invitation to a journalism conference in Russia. The event brought together American and Russian journalists to talk about obstacles faced by reporters in both countries. It was just supposed to be a long weekend in Moscow, but all air travel was grounded after a volcano erupted in Iceland. I'm not making this up. The visit stretched to 10 days, and I trailed along with the organizer of the conference. She was an outspoken civil society leader and journalist in Russia, and I witnessed her courage up close as she traveled the Moscow area documenting the Russian criminal justice system. Her day job was helping to nurture independent news reporting, a tall task. Even more affecting to me was her feeling that ordinary Russians put very little stock in independent news reporting. Russians were conditioned to discount information from any media source, government controlled or not, according to my new friend and others. In other words, sadly, there really was not much of an audience for the truth-telling that Russian reporters were attempting at considerable risk to themselves. At that journalism conference, I had prepared remarks emphasizing that reporters in America sometimes got blowback and verbal bullying when they wrote tough stories. Well, I quickly tore up those remarks after hearing the first speaker from Investigative Magazine in Russia recount how reporters there had disappeared or mysteriously become ill after writing stories about official corruption. Months after that Moscow conference, back in Milwaukee, I hosted 3 young Russian reporters who were working at independent media outlets in Russia. Though they didn't complain about threats to their safety there, our privilege here in the US was so starkly obvious that I wrote a piece about it for the Journal Sentinel. The headline was, "We have no idea how good it is here." Well, that was then, and this is now. Every year, a set of rankings are published that show how much freedom and safety journalists have in every country in the world. Back in 2010, Russia rated among the worst countries for press freedom and reporter safety. The US, by contrast, ranked among the 20 best. But by 2020, this so-called press freedom ranking showed that the United States of America had fallen 25 slots, down to 45th in the world. We're not Russia, to be certain. Russia, which has criminalized protest and anti-war news reports. Amid the crackdown in recent years, one of my Russian journalist friends became an attorney defending reporters and human rights organizations. No, we're not Russia, but we've fallen far. And of course, that's just one small slice of what's changed. In just over a decade, the landscape for news reporting in America has been remade, often, but not always, for the worse. My personal lens on this comes from, it's hard to admit, 40 years as a journalist in Milwaukee, all covering government, courts, and elections. I've also been teaching investigative journalism at Marquette part-time for 15 years on courses that focus on policing and elections. In my career, I've had a front row seat to, well, a lot. The transition to online, the massive meltdown of traditional newsrooms, as well as the welcome rise of nonprofit news and more diverse staffing of newsrooms. And, well, we've all seen the explosion of fake news and the widespread belief in conspiracies and the aggression against reporters and the use of some cable networks effectively as state media. As I've transitioned from active news reporting, my focus now is directing a public service journalism fellowship at Marquette, O'Brien. The program is dedicated to giving journalists 9 months to produce work that will expose injustice and ignite change. A big part of this is pairing up journalism students with professionals as we struggle to ensure that there is a next generation of news reporters. In my view, it's imperative to have as many critical eyes on the mechanics of government as possible. For perspective, when I started, the Journal Sentinel and the Sentinel between them had 400 to 500 news staff. That number at the combined paper is now 100. That is a massive, massive loss. Yes, it's easier than ever for regular people now to keep an eye on their government through the internet. And yes, there are big advantages to leaving behind the exclusionary lens of white editors and white writers' so-called objectivity. But I am worried about the long-term future of journalism and truth-telling, and I suspect that you are as well. You might wonder what this has to do with religion, and in particular with Unitarian Universalism. My purpose here today is to try to move us past paralyzing despair by proposing ways to defend our UU fourth principle, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. You and I are not going to solve these issues in an hour, but I hope I can inspire some reflection and action, even if we don't agree on everything. I think we all feel a sense of helplessness in the face of massively funded disinformation. We can't change that quickly, but we can start with ourselves and those around us. So I want to start by making this personal and making it local. Let's consider a concept. The media are us. When it comes to local and state news, all of us probably have preferred ways of staying current. No matter what those are, the organizations producing that news likely are struggling to stay afloat and truly need your help. And it's not just financial. It's morale building and connection, things you are good at and only cost time, not treasure. The thing is, people often see reporters as them or the other and are wary about approaching them. It's a shame, really. Reporters actually crave connection and constructive engagement with readers who are out in the community and know things of interest. If nothing else, these positive encounters can remind reporters that the increasingly vile attacks they receive are not the whole story. You may think we'd shrug off being called enemies of the people, but those attacks are quite demoralizing, in part because reporters have been willing to work for relatively little pay if they felt like they were filling a cherished role in society and doing some good in the world. So when it comes to despair over disinformation, their despair is your despair times 10. So what to do? I want to offer a few thoughts here. One thing to think about doing is email local reporters. Call them, talk to them at events and in your neighborhood. Lobby for story coverage, guide them to story ideas and sources. Write opinion pieces and submit them. A few words to the wise about how to approach a reporter. They probably will not bite, but they can be wary at first, accustomed as they are to attacks and public relations spin. If your first contact with them is to give a blast of criticism, you're off to a bad start. Remember, they're trying to create the first rough draft of history on tight deadlines. Don't conflate a mistake with bad faith on their part. Yes, I am saying reporters are people too. Most importantly, when you admire the work of a reporter or an outlet, share their work far and wide. Ask who their editor is and tell that person how much you appreciate the reporter. Tell all your friends. Okay, now we get to one of the elephants in the room, financial support of the media. Now, I know not everyone has extra funds, and God knows I'm not suggesting we cut back on our vital contributions to our own first church. But I wonder if we all shouldn't be doing more to support local media with our pocketbooks. When I was pondering this, I tried a little thought exercise. I added up how many subscriptions I have to streaming services like Netflix, Hulu, BritBox, etc. And then I counted how many subscriptions I have to news media outlets. To my surprise, entertainment outnumbered news. We've all gotten so used to free news through our social media feeds, but that shortchanges the news outlets that Facebook and others use to build our feeds. And the fact is, we can subscribe for practically nothing, at least for a while. I saw a New York Times offer for $1 a week for a whole year of the digital. The Journal Sentinel has similar deals. JS is still going strong, still a strong regional outlet that's adding staff and has had an infusion of younger, more diverse talent in recent years. You might consider a gift to a hyperlocal nonprofit site like the Neighborhood News Service in Milwaukee, which covers city neighborhoods. Think about the national Report for America, which is kind of a Peace Corps model for staffing local newsrooms. Check out other media covering Milwaukee's Black and Latino communities and its neighborhoods. Outlets such as the Milwaukee Community Journal, Milwaukee Courier, El Conquistador, Radio Milwaukee 88.9 does great community work. Radio stations attuned to the Black community such as WNOV and 101.7 The Truth are getting more attention. Here's the thing, when you become a paying supporter, engaging constructively, you'll have more standing to approach the editors of the outlet and advocate for coverage of issues, and maybe they'll run an op-ed. So once you have their ear, maybe you can bend it for them on my behalf. I have a couple pet causes. Demand that local news outlets recommit to covering local elections and candidates in a detailed and serious way, not just as a horse race. These outlets enjoy First Amendment protections and they have responsibilities to public service. We should know the backgrounds of candidates before they win elections. Insist that even in an era of clickbait, that local media give attention to dull but important stories, the kind that I made a career out of, dull but important, DBI. 10 years ago, how many of us are reading stories and reacting about gerrymandering, election administration, campaign finance rules, police policies, and government budgets? Probably not many of us. But how important are those topics right now? We are all reading about them and worrying. When media outlets go deep on topics like these, make sure they know you appreciate those DBI stories. So, what else can we do to promote our fourth UU principle and fight disinformation? Let me offer a few more suggestions. Think about very intentionally curating your own news content. Do it in a way that gets away from so much opinion, sensationalism, and bubbles. Start with local news involving reporters who live and work here. Engage directly with the publications that you consider honest and open-minded. For national news, don't hesitate to look outside the country, like BBC and CBC. Check out positive, smart journalism, such as that associated with the Solutions Journalism Network. Look at wire services, such as the Associated Press. When confronted with news outlets you're unfamiliar with, do some digging. Where do they get their funding? Do they identify their reporters and give their backgrounds? Look at whether your news sources have diverse newsrooms or cover all communities. Something I've done in recent years, decolonize your media and social media experiences. Intentionally follow or like a diverse set of voices on social media to broaden your thinking. It just takes a few minutes. Another piece of advice, don't mistake social media channels for a real live cross-section of people. It is not. Don't reflexively or instantly share social media posts on breaking news. Never accept a headline as being from a real news source. Click through and notice whether the reporting is even there to back it up. Read and listen to books, actual books. We all remember books. If you are of a certain political persuasion, make an effort to find intellectually honest and civil voices on the other side, even if you disagree. Tune in to shows such as KCRW's Left, Right, and Center podcast, which feature vigorous and respectful debates. Take advantage of all the podcasts that are out there now, both local and national. Before I close, I want to take a hard look at ourselves in the mirror or in the smartphone. Consider it a moment of selfie reflection. Are we personally encouraging an atmosphere of candor and truth-telling in our own writings and posts, in our family and among friends? Are we using our influence to encourage groupthink or to repel important new information? Are we taking advantage of real-life chances to see how politics and elections really work? We can get involved, volunteer, show up. The politicians do notice. Are we abandoning truth-seeking even when, especially when, we are convinced our side or our view is usually or always right? Honest journalism at times will turn up evidence that contradicts our own beliefs. As hard as it may be, let's resist the urge to demonize regular people who get caught up in propaganda spewed by powerful forces. Persistent, respectful, personal engagement is the way to help people out of the rabbit hole of conspiracies. Let's remember that conspiracy theory victims are products of life experiences we know sometimes nothing about. Learn about those experiences, see the whole person. When I look in my own selfie mirror, I think back to my years as a reporter and times when I would overreact when a talk show host on the radio would stir up hateful phone calls or emails to the paper to complain about a story of mine. It was easy to condemn such anonymous, vile attacks. Over time, though, I decided to selectively and calmly engage rather than deflect a lot of those contacts. And it led to a real discovery for me. In many cases, those critics would wilt when they realized they were talking to a flesh and blood person, and when I would ask about who they were in real life. Many had not read the story they were complaining about. But I often took something from those conversations as well, once we realized that neither one of us was the hard stereotype the other had assumed. Basically, everybody's got a story. Part of my own story is about the deep, deep, deep despair that I have felt, both personally and professionally, as we watch truth-telling and reality-based discourse seem to crumble as cornerstones of our society. It's a despair I know many of you share. For me, my 3 decades in the trenches reporting on local government seemed like it had all been for naught. Suddenly down was up, wrong was right. I am not over it, but I've decided to stop wallowing in it. I figure that I am still in a position of privilege, and it's been said that the privileged have the least right to paralysis in hard times. If I give up, if we give up, what does that bode? So let's model the behavior we want and start with baby steps. Start small, start somewhere. Maybe you have influence only over yourself and a few others. But isn't that how change happens, one person at a time? As I pondered all this while preparing for today's service, I kept coming back to the courage of those Russian reporters and editors I met 10 years ago as they struggled against harsh realities. One told us, quote, "All the TV stations and newspapers in Russia are actually owned by state officials or their relatives." One let us know that in Milwaukee, there is extreme independence in your work and in your relationship with officials that we don't have in Russia. So let's take those words as a reminder that America's journalism is worth saving. It would be a real shame for us to let the independent press die off in this country because of feelings of helplessness and despair and our shock at how quickly things have changed. It may slip away if we let it, and then where will we be? Thank you.
Dear ones, I'll leave you with these closing words by Arthur Foote. May peace dwell within our hearts and understanding in our minds. May courage steel our wills and love of truth forever guide us. May it be so.
We are going, heaven knows where we are going. We know within, and we will get there. Heaven knows how we will get there, but we know we will. Whoa, yeah, yeah. 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 We are going.